Hi, I'm Codex, and this is my patch 9.1.5 Fury Warrior Guide. This guide is intended to help people who are new to playing Fury in patch 9.1.5 get off and running.
As you can tell from the video length, there's a lot to cover,
I've done extensive timestamping,
so that if you don't want to watch the entire video, you can quickly get to the topics that you're interested in, or skip things that you don't care about, such as the following disclaimer. This guide is only useful if it makes sense to you and you're able to act on what you've learned. Whether or not it makes sense to you obviously depends on how I explain things. While I'll be doing my best to try and explain everything as clearly as possible, I sometimes have really weird ways of thinking about and describing things. Just because you don't understand something that I'm talking about doesn't mean that it's a confusing topic or that you're not smart enough or good enough to understand it. It means that I did not explain the topic in a way that works for how your brain likes to make sense of things. This is why I encourage you to seek out other guides as well, because someone else might have a way of explaining something that triggers that light bulb moment and makes you finally get it. If you're still confused about any topic that I cover or allude to in this video, feel free to ask about it in the comments, and I will do my best to try and answer it in a way that makes sense for you. The next thing to understand going into this guide is that the information is only accurate as of the start of patch
9.1.5.
Any future theory crafting discoveries, as well as any future patches or hotfixes, could make the information presented in this video entirely wrong. Now, with those disclaimers out of the way, let's get started. The Fury spec revolves around dual wielding and what I call a pump and dump playstyle. The most basic component of this playstyle is to generate rage as quickly as possible and then dump it by using Rampage. There are a ton of other pieces that go into this playstyle, and I'll be talking about them, but all of these pieces end up revolving around generating rage and then spending it on Rampage. So let's start laying some foundation and talking about all of those pieces that make Fury what it is. Fury Warriors generate rage through auto attacks and also our damaging abilities. Our main hand swings generate 6 rage, and our offhand swings generate 3 rage. As for our default abilities, Raging Blow generates 12 rage, Bloodthirst generates 8 rage, Whirlwind generates 3 rage plus 1 rage per target that it hits, up to 5 targets. So if it only hits 1 target, then it'll generate 4 rage, and if it hits all 5 targets, then it's going to generate 8. If the target is below 20% health, then we can also use Execute, which generates 20 rage. Ultimately, the numbers that I just threw at you are there so I can be precise. The key takeaway from this is that we have a bunch of abilities and they generate different amounts of rage. I'll be talking about ability usage in more detail later on, but for now, it's important to try and internalize the idea that Execute generates the most rage, but isn't usable most of the time. And for the abilities that we can always use, Raging Blow generates the most, then Bloodthirst is second, and lastly is Whirlwind. Getting used to this is important because, as previously mentioned, our goal when playing Fury is to generate rage as quickly as possible and then dump it by using Rampage. Now, depending on what talents you take, you could get other abilities that can generate rage, and it's important to spend some time practicing and getting used to how much rage those abilities grant relative to your other abilities. So, for example, there's Dragon's Roar and Siegebreaker. They both generate 10 rage, putting them between Raging Blow and Bloodthirst, but if you were to talent into Onslaught, that ability gives 15 rage, placing it above Raging Blow. I'll be talking about these talents and abilities in a bit, but before we get there, I still have some more foundation to lay. Because I love terrible analogies, if Fury Warriors are an engine that produce DPS, rage generation is the fuel for that engine, and Enrage is the oxygen that enables that fuel to combust and explode. Enrage is a 4-second buff that gives us 15% haste, 10% movement speed, and increases our damage by 11%. The increased damage modifier is affected by our mastery, so even with modest gear, that damage modifier will typically be above 25%. Now, there are 2 ways to get Enrage. Using Rampage, which always grants Enrage, and using Bloodthirst, which has a 30% chance to proc Enrage. Getting a percent damage increase is obviously good, but because Enrage also grants haste, it means that we're going to be auto-attacking faster, meaning we're going to generate more rage from auto-attacks, and we're going to have a shorter global cooldown, which means more abilities that grant rage. This leads to being able to use Rampage more often, which grants Enrage, and as you can see, we have ourselves a feedback loop. Once you have gotten used to the idea that playing Fury is about generating rage quickly and then spending it on Rampage, the next thing that you want to internalize is that part of how we do that is by maximizing Enrage uptime. Or in other words, keeping the Enrage buff up as much as possible. Because Fury is all about building rage until we get at least 80 and then can spend it by casting Rampage, our quote-unquote rotation is basically whatever we do in between each Rampage. So understand that whenever I'm talking about a rotation or using damaging abilities, I'm talking about it from the perspective that it's something that we do during the time between 2 Rampages. Now, there are a lot of things about the primary Fury Warrior abilities that make them seem way more complicated than they actually are. The cooldowns of Raging Blow and Bloodthirst don't line up nicely to create an immediately recognizable pattern, which means that Fury doesn't have a fixed rotation. Additionally, Raging Blow has multiple charges and has a chance to reset its cooldown. Bloodthirst has a chance to proc and rage, and Whirlwind generates different amounts of rage depending on how many targets it hits. These things add a lot of nuance to mastering the intricacies of the spec, but the principles of when you should use each of these abilities are pretty straightforward. As previously mentioned, for our normal rotational abilities, Raging Blow generates the most rage, followed by Bloodthirst, and then Whirlwind. Conveniently, when looking at single target DPS, the damage that each ability does follows the same hierarchy. This means that generally speaking, you should be prioritizing Raging Blow first, and if you can't use Raging Blow, then you should use Bloodthirst, and if you can't do either, then you should use Whirlwind. Even if you expand this view out to include Execute, the priority doesn't really change. You just put Execute at the top because it generates more rage and does more damage than Raging Blow. However, this hierarchy is not entirely correct, and that's because of Enrage. Bloodthirst has a chance to proc Enrage, and since Enrage is incredibly important to our DPS, that complicates things and changes our priorities in certain situations. Specifically, if you're not enraged, Bloodthirst takes priority over Raging Blow. Now, I personally hate talking about using abilities in terms of priority like this because I think it's too abstract for practical use, but it is the most succinct way of talking generally about deciding to use one ability or another. So now that I've explained it generally, let's talk specifically about what is meant when I say that Bloodthirst takes priority over Raging Blow when you're not enraged, and why. Just like every other DPS spec, the ABC rule applies to Fury, which is an acronym for Always Be Casting. And it means exactly what it says. You should always be using an ability at the moment that the global cooldown ends. Because of the ABC rule, and because of how the cooldowns of Bloodthirst and Raging Blow interact, a significant amount of the time, you don't actually need to think about what ability takes priority, because there's no decision to make. You're just going to be using the one that's available. And then if you can't do either, you're going to use Whirlwind. Now, obviously, sometimes you will have to decide between a Bloodthirst and a Raging Blow. That is, both of them are off cooldown, and therefore implies that your next two global cooldowns are going to be a Bloodthirst and a Raging Blow, and you just simply have to decide what do you do first. If you're not enraged and did Raging Blow, then Bloodthirst, you're going to get the damage of a Raging Blow and a Bloodthirst, just as one would expect. However, if you did a Bloodthirst, then a Raging Blow, you're going to get the damage of a Bloodthirst, and 30% of the time, you're going to get an Enrage proc, which means that you're going to get the damage of an enraged Raging Blow, which, even if you account for all of the variables that I'm purposely omitting for simplicity, it still ends up being more damage to do Bloodthirst first, even though it does less damage. Now, if you already are enraged, then the order doesn't affect the outcome of the damage, and therefore, you should start with whichever one does the most damage, aka Raging Blow. So let's take all this information and tie it back together and then put a bow on it. Once you have enough rage to use Rampage, you should do it. In between using Rampage, if you can use Execute, you should use it. If Execute isn't available or is on cooldown, you should use Raging Blow as much as you can, and if you can't use Raging Blow, then use Bloodthirst. If you're not enraged and have to decide between using Raging Blow and Bloodthirst, then you should use Bloodthirst. If you can't do anything else, then fill that global cooldown with a Whirlwind. Make sure to practice this basic rotation until you can do it without thinking. Pretty much every other thing that we do in terms of doing damage as a Fury Warrior leverages this rotation as its foundation. Now, a reasonable thing to ask is, if maximizing enraged uptime is so important that we're willing to modify our rotation to maximize it, if we're already enraged and can use Rampage, should we delay that Rampage to try and maximize enraged uptime? The answer to that question is that while it would make sense to do that, because Blizzard increased the cost of Rampage to 80 rage when Shadowlands was released, delaying a Rampage at any rage level risks rage capping yourself, which is not desirable. I have a video where I rant about this problem and why the change should be reverted, but long story short, if Rampage is usable, you should use it immediately rather than delaying it to try and increase your enrage uptime. AoE follows the same principle as single target DPS, but adds a new variable, Whirlwind stacks. Whenever you use Whirlwind, you get 2 stacks of a buff that allows your other abilities to hit 4 extra targets for just under half the damage that it did to the main target. This means that if there are 2 targets, then it's not as important to cleave every single ability that you do, and your primary goal for handling Whirlwind stacks is to ensure that you have Whirlwind up whenever you use Rampage so that you can cleave it onto the second target. If there are 3 or more targets, you want to make sure that you have the Whirlwind buff up every single time you use another ability. And because you get 2 stacks of Whirlwind, this means that you should be using Whirlwind every third ability. While ideally you should never overcap your rage, because of how much extra damage is provided by a cleaved rampage, if you need to delay a rampage in order to get the whirlwind buff up, it's better to whirlwind, overcap your rage, than cleave a rampage than it is to rampage a single target.
One extra thing that I want to note though is that if you are running the Merciless Bone Grinder conduit, then it will typically be better to just spam whirlwind in between rampages while that buff is active, though I'll be talking more about that later on.
Recklessness doubles your rage generation and gives your abilities 20% increased crit chance. Recklessness has a base cooldown of 90 seconds and a base duration of 10 seconds. It's also off the global cooldown, so you can use it at the same time as other abilities. Generally speaking, Recklessness should be used as soon as possible every time it's available. The best time to use Recklessness during combat is immediately after a rampage because it doesn't generate rage, and you can't be caught off guard by the extra rage generation and accidentally rage cap yourself because you just spent 80 rage that global cooldown. Bladestorm is an optional cooldown that Fury Warriors can get if they talent into it. Bladestorm does a fixed amount of AoE damage and generates 20 rage over 4 seconds, with that duration being reduced by haste, making it so that it will do the same amount of damage over a shorter period of time. While Bladestorming, you can auto-attack, but you can't use other abilities. Bladestorm has a cooldown of 1 minute, and unlike Recklessness, Bladestorm is on the global cooldown, but the same logic applies. Ideally, you should be using Bladestorm immediately after a rampage, and that's because you want to be enraged when you're Bladestorming because it will make a massive amount of difference in the damage that it does. If you're Bladestorming and you get enough rage to cast Rampage, if there's only one target, you should cancel the Bladestorm buff and then use Rampage. However, if there's 2 or more targets, then you should just let the Bladestorm go for its full duration, even if that means that you're going to overcap on rage. The easiest way to remove the Bladestorm buff is to create a macro that includes the line /cancel aura Bladestorm. I personally macro this into casting Rampage, and I've put that macro in the video description. Siegebreaker is an optional 30-second cooldown ability that can be talented into. Siegebreaker is a single target ability that generates 10 rage and applies a 10-second debuff that increases the damage that you do to the target by 15%. The optimal time to use this ability is right before a rampage, so that way you can maximize the number of times that you get to use Rampage within that 10-second duration. It's also worth noting that this debuff can be cleaved onto other mobs via Whirlwind. Dragon's Roar is an optional cooldown that Fury Warriors can get if they talent into it. It has a 30-second cooldown, generates 10 rage, and provides decent single-target DPS with extra burst potential if it crits. While it is an AoE ability, it does reduce damage to extra targets. If you're running Dragon's Roar, the optimal time to use it is when enraged, and also while the Siegebreaker debuff is applied if you're talented into that ability. As of right now in patch 9.1.5, for single target DPS, Fury has basically 3 different playstyles that you can choose from. These playstyles and nearly every build choice that you have is dependent on which legendary you choose. In other words, your legendary choice drastically affects your talent choices, your covenant choices, your preferred covenants, and even, to some extent, your best stats. Once I get through all of this, I promise that I'm going to talk about the AoE implications and considerations for these playstyles, but just know that for now, I'm going to be focusing exclusively on single-target DPS. So let's start by going over the big picture characteristics of these playstyles, and then start drilling down into each of them. Sinful Surge is a Venthyr-only legendary power that makes Condemn add time to your Recklessness. For that reason, this playstyle revolves around trying to extend your cooldowns and making them last as long as possible. Signet of Tormented Kings is a legendary power that makes using Recklessness, Bladestorm, or Avatar cast one of the other 2 options at a reduced duration. In practice, this means that using Recklessness can grant you either a Bladestorm or an Avatar, and casting a Bladestorm can grant you either a Recklessness or an Avatar. This playstyle revolves around trying to increase the number of times you get to use your cooldowns. Lastly, Elysian Might is a Kyrian-only legendary that doubles the length of your Spirit Bastion ground effect to 8 seconds, and makes standing in that ground effect grant 25% increased crit damage. This playstyle revolves around amplifying the strength of your cooldown windows. So, to summarize what I think are the key differences between these playstyles, Sinful Surge is trying to make your burst windows longer, Signet of Tormented Kings is trying to give you more burst windows, and Elysian Might is trying to make each burst window stronger. Now, there is a 4th legendary that's technically viable, but it does not have a meaningfully distinct playstyle, and it's also not that popular for a number of reasons, so I'll be talking about that later. So with this big picture overview in mind, let's go into detail on each of these 3 playstyles, and what are the best build options for each of them. Even without the Sinful Surge legendary, the damage profile of Venthyr Fury Warriors is generally U-shaped, meaning that most of their damage comes at the beginnings and endings of the fight, and that's simply because of when Condemn is usable. Once you start using Sinful Surge, it starts becoming possible to get close to and potentially even reach 100% uptime on Recklessness during Condemn windows, which further amplifies this U-shaped damage profile. If you choose to go this playstyle, then obviously you're going to need to select Venthyr as your Covenant. Your best Soulbind choice is going to be Theotar, and you should opt for running 3 Potency Conduits. To do this, I personally would suggest going the route of grabbing the Endurance Conduit plus Watch the Shoes, then the Potency Conduit plus Token of Appreciation, and then it's always Tea Time and the Finesse Conduit. Your 3 best Potency Conduits are going to be Hack and Slash, Ashen Juggernaut, and Depths of Insanity. For your talents, you're going to want to run Sudden Death, Double Time, Massacre, Warpaint, Cruelty, Dragon's Roar, and either Anger Management or Reckless Abandon. Generally speaking, for longer fights, Anger Management is going to be better because it allows you to use Recklessness more often during those Condemn phases, and Reckless Abandon will be better on fights that are shorter where you wouldn't be able to gain that extra usage. With that said, there are some problems with Reckless Abandon. Reckless Abandon changes your Bloodthirst and Raging Blow to make them hit harder, but it also attaches a charge effect to Raging Blow. This charge has no minimum distance, meaning that even if you're in melee range, if you're considered to be even 1 yard away from your target, you're going to charge at them. This can cause small boss movements to cause you to get clipped by mechanics if you press Raging Blow at the wrong time. For example, if you're doing Painsmith, if you have Recklessness up, you cannot use Raging Blow at all on the spike balls because it will kill you, and also if you're passing through the gap and the boss moves just a little bit left or right, there's a very high likelihood that you'll activate the charge, and then you're going to move at an angle and clip the edge of the nearest ball's hitbox. Additionally, because of spell batching, if you get targeted by a run-out mechanic, but a Raging Blow has been locked in, then it doesn't matter how fast you reacted because you're just going to charge back to the boss and then need to run out again. So while there are many circumstances where it may be better to run Reckless Abandon, in practice, it's probably just safer to run Anger Management instead, unless you are prepared to deal with those annoyances. This also segues into talking about some of the other limitations of this build. Most notably is the fact that this build's damage requires the existence of Condemn phases. In Sanctum of Domination, the Sylvanas fight doesn't have an execute phase at the end because the encounter ends well before the 35% mark, meaning that this playstyle is really only strong during phase 1, and has no benefit whatsoever during phase 2 or phase 3. The second issue with this playstyle is that it is heavily impacted by downtime. Any time not spent being able to hit Condemn when it's usable is reduced Recklessness uptime. If you get targeted for mechanics that require you to move away from the boss, or if you have to swap targets, that could cause you to lose your Recklessness and significantly reduce your overall damage. Finally, this setup has no real strength in AoE, and this limitation has been further compounded in 9.1.5 because Blizzard did not remove the target cap on the Whirlwind buff, allowing us to cleave our abilities. When running Sinful Surge, outside of Condemn windows, there's nothing particularly different about this playstyle compared to the sort of standardized way of playing Fury. The only real exception to this is that you should be paying attention to the boss's health percentage when Recklessness is coming off cooldown, because you want to make sure that you'll be able to use it as quickly as possible once you reach Condemn range. Once you are in Condemn range, you should be using Recklessness, and then in between each Rampage, you will likely only need to use Condemn and Raging Blow before you're able to Rampage again, though depending on the timings of your melee swings, you might need to use an extra Raging Blow, or a Bloodthirst if you don't have Raging Blow charges available. Pay attention to any sudden death procs that you get and try to capitalize on them as best you can. Getting that extra Condemn to extend your Recklessness is worth getting rage capped for a GCD if that's what you have to do. Now, despite all of the problems that this build has that I just laid out, in situations where you do have both Condemn windows and you're able to have high uptime on the boss, this playstyle is extremely strong. The Signet of Tormented Kings playstyle is one that revolves around getting the most number of uses of your cooldowns as possible. Now, this legendary power is not restricted to a single covenant. The best 2 covenant options are going to be Kyrian and Night Fae, and they both tend to sim really close to each other, with Kyrian coming out just slightly ahead of Night Fae by around 0.1 to 0.2%. Now, with that said, if you're going Kyrian, you're likely going to be going Elysian Might, as that's restricted to Kyrian only. So I'm going to be talking about this from the Night Fae side of things. Just know that you could also do this playstyle as Kyrian, and the logic that you would use for picking talents and also potency conduits is basically the same, regardless of which one of them you choose. If you're going to be running Signet, then for talents, you're going to want to take Sudden Death, Double Time, Frenzy, Warpaint, Cruelty, Bladestorm, and Anger Management. For your Soulbind, you're going to want to go with Dreamweaver, and then go the route of grabbing the Endurance Conduit, then Soothing Voice plus the Potency Conduit, and finally Waking Dreams and the Finesse Conduit. For your 3 Potency Conduits, you're going to want to run Depths of Insanity, Hack and Slash, and Destructive Reverberations. Personally, I nicknamed this build the Gas Pedal build because with this setup, you're going to have 3 different sources of haste multipliers coming from Enrage, Frenzy, and Field of Blossoms every time you use Ancient Aftershock. And when all 3 of these multipliers are active, you can have some pretty ridiculous haste levels. All of this extra haste means that you're going to have more melee swings and also more GCDs to generate rage, which then means more rampages to spend that rage on, which further reduces the cooldown of your next recklessness. Typically, this is going to average out to making your recklessness usable roughly every 60 seconds, if not a bit faster. If you're lusting on pull, then it's not uncommon to get your second recklessness around 40 seconds into the fight. Now, there's a couple things to note about running this legendary. First, you're going to want to create a Cancel Aura macro to terminate your Bladestorm. This is because Bladestorm does more single target DPS than Bloodthirst and Raging Blow, but it does not do more DPS than Rampage and Execute. Therefore, whenever you're Bladestorming, once you have enough rage to Rampage, you should get out of that Bladestorm and then use Rampage. During Execute range, you should also be doing the same thing for Execute, though if you're outside of Execute range, don't bother canceling a Bladestorm for a Sudden Death proc, because you have plenty of time to decide when to use that Execute. I personally attach my Cancel Aura macro to Rampage, and you can find that macro in the description of this video. The next thing to understand is that because you can proc Avatar, which grants Rage, it's best to cast Bladestorm and Recklessness immediately after using a Rampage. This ensures that you won't Rage cap if you get an Avatar proc, and it also ensures that you'll be enraged if you start Bladestorming, which because of our mastery has a very significant impact on the damage done by that Bladestorm. The Elysian Might legendary power is Kyrian only. It doubles the duration of your Spear of Bastion to 8 seconds, and makes standing in the ground effect increase your crit damage by 25%. The Elysian Might playstyle for single target generally revolves around maximizing the effectiveness of your cooldowns when they line up. When running Elysian Might, in single target, you're going to want to take Sudden Death, Double Time, Frenzy, Warpaint, Cruelty, Dragon's Roar, and Siegebreaker. For your Soulbind, you're going to want to pick Mykonikos and go the path of running 3 Potency Conduits by grabbing Forgelight Filter and Soulsteel Clamps. You're also going to want to go the path of grabbing Soulsteel Spectrometer and the Endurance Conduit. It's worth noting that if you're running Signet as Kyrian, then this is the same Soulbind tree that you would want to run. For your Potency Conduits, you're going to want to be running Hack and Slash, Adaptive Armor Fragment, and Vicious Contempt. Part of the reason why this is a distinct playstyle is the fact that you're running Siegebreaker and Dragon's Roar, and that playstyle adds a bunch of extra considerations to your play if you want to try and squeeze out the maximum possible DPS. Both Dragon's Roar and Siegebreaker have a 30-second cooldown, and ideally they should be used in succession to keep them synced up. However, you also want to try to fit as many Rampages as possible into the Siegebreaker 10-second debuff window. And because of the special crit multiplier that Dragon Roar has, it can suffer greatly if it's used if you're not enraged. In an ideal world, you would use Siegebreaker, which would put you at just enough rage to be able to Rampage, which you would then use, and then you would use Dragon's Roar. The obvious problem with this scenario is that you can't always guarantee that that's going to happen. Trying to ensure the scenario incentivizes you to delay your cooldowns in order to get a more favorable lineup, but because we don't run Anger Management, Recklessness is on a 90-second cooldown, and delaying Siegebreaker and Dragon's Roar means desynchronizing it with Recklessness. This balancing act between ensuring cooldown synchronization and trying to get the ideal order of operations is even further complicated by Spear of Bastion, which in single target is going to have a cooldown of 56 seconds due to the effusive M accelerator. In general, it's going to be best to wait to use Spear alongside Siegebreaker and Dragon's Roar in order to maximize the crit damage potential of Dragon's Roar. This means that you're going to want to use Siegebreaker, and then you're going to want to use Spear, and then you're going to want to use Dragon's Roar. And somewhere in there, you're likely also going to need to fit in a Rampage. And any delay that you make with any one of these cooldowns can come back to haunt you later, because that desynchronization will persist throughout the fight. When used every minute like this, Spear of Bastion and Recklessness will line up every 3 minutes. During these windows, you're going to have 20% increased crit chance on your abilities, your crits are going to do 25% increased damage, as well as the 15% more damage overall from Siegebreaker. During these lineups, you're really hoping for Dragon's Roar to crit because the crit damage bonus of Elysian Might is multiplicative, meaning that if it does crit, it's actually going to do 375% increased damage. Again, as I've mentioned, there is a lot of temptation to delay using these short cooldowns in order to get a more favorable lineup, but you must temper that by understanding that unless the fight has extended periods of downtime, you're not going to be able to get rid of that desynchronization, and it can only get worse over the fight, so you need to be careful not to delay too much because you need all of your cooldowns to overlap. So let's start comparing these different playstyles and get more into why I felt it necessary to almost make 3 mini guides inside of this guide. For single target DPS, with Signet of Tormented Kings as a baseline, on paper, Elysian Might yields roughly 2% more DPS than Signet, and then Sinful Surge yields roughly 4% more DPS than Signet. But that's on paper. I've already discussed a number of the shortcomings of each of these playstyles, but there are other things to consider as well. Because most fights aren't purely single target or purely AoE, something to consider is the AoE capabilities of the playstyle in its single target configuration, and then also how much you need to change in order to maximize that playstyle's AoE capabilities. So let's talk about that. If you're running Sinful Surge, then your damage does not scale particularly well in AoE because you're primarily going to be focused on doing as many condemns as possible to maximize your recklessness uptime. In AoE, you would now need to start cleaving these condemns onto other targets with Whirlwind, which of course means using Whirlwind instead of other abilities, and generally this leads to getting either fewer condemns out or fewer rampages. If you're doing a fight that has a significant AoE component, realistically, your best bet is to just simply not run Sinful Surge and run Signet instead, even if you're Venthyr. If you're running Signet, then for the most part, you're already in your AoE build. Depending on the context of the fight, though, it might be best to swap Soulbinds to Karain if you're Night Fae. The one other change that would be made to maximize your AoE DPS is to run the Merciless Bone Grinder Potency Conduit, which if you're Night Fae and swapping to Karain, you can have that conduit already in place when you swap to Karain, and you would not need to go back to your Sanctum to change it. So, really the only thing you need to do is use a tome so that you can swap Soulbinds, and then you would be in the best possible AoE setup. If you're running Elysian Might, you're going to want to swap to running Bladestorm instead of Dragon's Roar, which can be done with a tome, and you're also going to want to run Merciless Bone Grinder and potentially also Piercing Verdict if you still wanted to run triple potency, or you could run 2 potency conduits and grab Hammer of Genesis. Now, unlike Night Fae, the best Kyrian Soulbind for both single target and AoE DPS is Mikanikos. That means it is not possible to run these different potency conduit setups without going back to your Sanctum and making the swap, meaning that going back and forth from the optimal single target to the optimal AoE setup is much more of a chore. Though, in a pinch, just using a tome and swapping to Bladestorm will typically yield around 2% more DPS than Dragon's Roar, so that is at least an option. In their respective optimal single target setups and their optimal AoE setups, both Elysian Might and Signet of Tormented Kings are fairly equal, with the difference usually being less than 1%, though in my analysis, Elysian Might typically did come out ahead of Signet. Another thing to consider is that Ancient Aftershock is target capped, whereas Spear of Bastion is not. So if you're doing high target AoE, then it's going to be better to either run Elysian Might or be Kyrian when you're playing with Signet.
So, set all of what I said for the last 15 minutes aside,
because there's actually another option that you have. If you're willing to live vicariously through the parses of others, then going Necrolord and running Glory can yield more net raid DPS than even being Venthyr in its best case scenario. However, your personal DPS is going to take a significant hit. This playstyle, generally speaking, is sort of halfway in between Signet and Elysian Might, and that's because you're going to want to grab Dragon's Roar and Anger Management. But because of taking these 2 talents and also the fact that this playstyle isn't really built around your personal DPS, it's not really hyper-focused on trying to line up all of these different cooldowns and whatnot, it's just using things as they come up. If you're going to be a Banner Boy, then you're either going to Soulbind with Bonesmith or Plague Devicer. In both cases, you're going to want to run triple potency, and for your potency conduits, you would run Depths of Insanity, Veteran's Repute, and Hack and Slash. So let's talk about some more AoE considerations that are going to be true regardless of which playstyle you're choosing. For all 3 of these playstyles, the optimal thing to do in AoE is to take Bladestorm and run Merciless Bone Grinder. A big reason why this is the case is that it had its value doubled in patch 9.1.5. Something to note is that you will still get this buff even if you terminate a Bladestorm with a cancel or a macro. While this buff is active, Whirlwind will hit a single target about as hard as a Raging Blow, making it the highest damage AoE ability that we can use aside from a cleaved Rampage. If you're running this conduit, your best strategy is that once your Blade Storm ends, you should just spam Whirlwinds as much as possible in between your rampages. Don't bother with spending your Whirlwind stacks to cleave your other abilities because they will literally do less damage than just spamming Whirlwind. Something worth noting in really high target AoE scenarios is that because the Whirlwind cleave buff is target capped, but Whirlwind itself isn't, if there's enough targets present, then Rampage's damage will eventually get outscaled by Whirlwind, though it will still be beneficial to use it simply to maintain uptime on Enrage. Next, because many AoE fights involve periodically spawning adds, all of these playstyles will typically swap to taking fresh meat instead of taking sudden death. And that's simply because having that guaranteed enrage when you bloodthirst a new target can significantly increase enrage uptime. A trick that you can use with this is that when final damage matters, it can be beneficial to use a mouse over macro to hit adds with a bloodthirst to proc that enrage without actually needing to target them. I've put the mouse over bloodthirst macro that I personally use in the description of this video. Another thing that you need to consider in AoE is that many fights will also require a lot of target swapping. Both the Elysian Might and the Signet of Tormented Kings playstyle will take Frenzy for single target fights, but the value provided by Frenzy suffers greatly every time you need to rebuild your stack. So on fights where you have to change targets a lot, or there's going to be frequent periods of downtime, it's generally best to take Massacre instead of Frenzy. Certain items within the Sanctum of Domination raid will have what are called Domination Sockets, and these sockets can be filled with Domination Shards. Domination Shards are like gems, but they typically have a proc effect rather than just having stats. There are 3 different types of shards: Blood, Frost, and Unholy Shards. Within each type of shard, there will be a Damage Shard, a Healing Shard, and a Defensive/Tertiary Shard. If you socket all 3 shards of a type, then you're going to get a set bonus depending on which shard type is socketed. Now, only certain item slots can have Domination Sockets, and for warriors, these slots are Helm, Shoulders, Chest, Bracers, and Gloves. Because of how strong Domination Shards are, ideally, you should be looking to get all 5 sockets, which means that you don't want to craft your Legendary on one of these slots if at all possible, because your Legendary item will not have a Domination Socket on it. Once you have all 5 sockets, the most optimal thing to do is to get the Unholy set bonus called Chaos Bane, which works the same way as the Shadowmoor Legendary effect that it's named after. This bonus provides a stacking strength buff that will explode once it reaches maximum stacks, doing AoE damage, and then gives you a large strength buff for 15 seconds. With the remaining 2 Domination Sockets, you should be looking to get the Frost Damage Shard, which gives you increased damage for 20 seconds when you've hit an enemy that you haven't touched yet, and then the Blood Damage Shard, which increases your damage when you have 50% or more HP than your target. When you only have 1 or 2 Domination Sockets, you should first be looking to get the Unholy Damage Shard, which provides a stacking % damage increase, and then either the Blood Damage Shard for single target DPS, or the Frost Damage Shard for AoE DPS and Mythic Plus. Now, it's important to understand that your stat priorities will change depending on pretty much every single variable that I've talked about in this video, plus the actual specific stats on your current gear. If you want to get a better sense of what stats are best for you, you can run a stat weight simulation on Raidbots with your personal setup and get a better understanding that way. But please keep in mind that there are a number of fundamental flaws to doing that type of simulation. So in practice, the best thing to do is generally just follow what Top Gear suggests is the best item for you, regardless of the specific stats on those items. Now, with all of that said, generally speaking, Haste and Mastery are likely going to be your 2 best friends, followed by Versatility and Crit. Though, if you're running Elysian Might, Crit will frequently be more beneficial than Haste. It all depends. All of our secondary stats are good. Use tools like Raidbots to get more information about your specific stat needs, as that's going to be far more accurate than anything that I could tell you. The choice between Single-Minded Fury and Titan's Grip is ultimately just a math problem. That's because gameplay-wise, they're the exact same. Rage generation is normalized such that auto attacks with one-handed weapons generate less rage per hit to account for their faster attack speed. Because of this, determining the better of the two comes down to answering the question, what provides more value? 12% increased damage, or the extra weapon DPS and stats provided by two-handed weapons. Now, I'll spare you the detailed math because this video is long enough already, but as item level increases, different item types scale at different rates, and two-handed weapons gain more benefit per item level than one-handed weapons. At the start of the expansion, Single-Minded Fury and Titan's Grip were almost dead even, and in some cases, Single-Minded Fury was better. But as we've gotten access to higher and higher item levels, the scaling of two-handed weapons has outpaced the benefit of Single-Minded Fury, making Titan's Grip the best choice in the vast majority of cases.
And that's everything that I think that you need to know in order to get up and running as a Fury Warrior in patch 9.1.5. I sincerely hope that this guide has been helpful for you. As patches, hotfixes, and new theory crafting discoveries occur and change what the best practices are for Fury Warriors, I will be making videos discussing and analyzing them. If you're confused about any part of this guide, feel free to ask and I will do my best to help you out. Alternatively, tell me why what I've said is wrong and why my opinions are dumb. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video and subscribe for more.